Is this? So, last speaker, probably because I have the most idiosyncratic / idiotic things to say. The topic was sort of, this is the problem with not paying too much attention when people say that your assigned topic is going to be classroom computing and aspirations, and then you have an image which doesn't seem to say anything about what the topic is. What's more surprising is that most of the talk might not either say anything what the topic of the talk is. So, what happened here is that there's two parts of it. First, so I was doing work on classroom computing in India, and I found a lot of things about how people perceived computers, which got me more interested in the sort of larger idea of aspirations and why ICTD is interesting. And what I'm going to try and do is talk more about that than any quantifiable results of what I have done. Firstly, why India? If you've noticed, a lot of the talks are about India, not just in this room, but anywhere that you want to go into ICTD work, that's the case. Because India is, well, partly because of these two contrasts. There's this guy, he's one of the top guys at Infosys, a major IT firm in India, and this contrast between the two worlds that we're looking at in India. So one of the reasons I think that India has become important in ICTD is the obvious thing of the sectoral growth in India. After 1991, the software industry has had this huge growth, and it's become this proxy for what development can mean in the third world. And look at India's software industry at rank with the rest of the world, whereas it still has this underdeveloped part to it. So the idea of a leapfrog from one stage to another using the service industry. What's also interesting about India, as opposed to a lot of the other aid destinations back a few years ago, was that it's relatively easy to do aid investment in India. So a lot of the early ICTD work went in there. Now, more importantly, I think there are some of the other interesting things is that there's a large quantity of transnational engineers from India. This ties in with the larger idea of software and development. So there's a great number of people from India, from villages or from middle class families who went from that situation to a sudden jump in their own financial status, almost like at a microcosm, meaning what development meant at the larger national level in the family level. So there was this family face of what development could be, and this also meant there was a sort of changing concept of who could be super wealthy. So if you look at the entire history of India from 1940, the post-independence period, the extreme wealth was a fairly limited group of people, either industrialists or mafia or whatever it is. Suddenly you have this huge software boom and people from middle class families who went on to engineering and so on and so forth and became very rich. So there's many things coming together to make India an interesting ICTD destination, not least of which is the huge number of Indian graduate students who, for one, populated Eric's group as well. So that's why India. Notions of technology. This photograph actually has some meaning to do with ICTD. This was like one of the guys who was driving us around when we were in South India, working in the schools, in doing research on how children use computers. This guy told me something very interesting. He has his whole mustache and attitude and all that, so he's a veritable macho man, right? So he had two daughters, and both the daughters were working in the software industry in Chennai. And he was from a fairly small village. Now, it was very unusual for young girls at that, unmarried young girls, to go and move and live in the city away from the family and do that. And he said that he was willing to do it because his daughters had jobs to do with computers. If they had any other kind of office job, he wouldn't want them to do it, but in computers it was okay. And he proceeded to give me several examples of others in his village whose daughters and so on and so forth were living and working in the call center industry. What's also interesting, and this is where this project started, is I started getting a number of responses from children with an almost mythical idea of what computers were. So we would go from a village to village and try and find out why are people interested in ICTD, and we increasingly get unusual answers of what is a computer and what it could be, even when people themselves have either never seen a computer very close up, or only knew of it from other people or from media or so on and so forth. This led me to think about what could be, how is it that people make up their mind about what a computer is, and we went ahead and interviewed a number of people, about there's about 175 people in the final list, in which we asked them, where have you seen a computer, what does a computer do, and so on and so forth. From that, I got to the point that there is the computer, and there's a cloud somewhere, and the notions of it which comes down eventually. In this case, it's a parent and a child on what the computer can do for the family. And this cloud is known as the discourse. Well, now, to tell you the truth, I had put this in the deadly blood font, but that seems to have disappeared, to show you what a threatening concept of discourse is among social scientists. But I'll still look at two specific parts of it and try and understand how these have influenced how people understand technology, and might even tell us something about looking at how adoption of technology works. I'm going to look at politics and cinema. Oh, well. The technology. So over here what I have is a number of politicians with something to do with computers. One is, of course, all three of them, interestingly enough, are from the south of India. Now, we looked at two talks earlier yesterday which had the theme of technology and politics. One was Jen's work on monetary benefits in various states to do with technology-related projects, and Renee's work on how the state wants to be seen. I think this is really important in understanding why a number of politicians starting in the mid-1990s and extending into today have taken this technological aura around themselves. I started doing Icpd because of the guy at the corner, the left-hand corner, with the fancy French beard. His name is Chandrababu Naidu. He was a chief minister of a southern state of Andhra Pradesh in India, and I actually helped make a website for him many years ago. It's interesting that this guy had a distinct public image of being a techno-savvy chief minister, and he would get photographed with a laptop. And what's interesting is that he would get photographed with a laptop and he'd be tapping it with one finger, but his photographs would be all over as being the cyber chief minister, and he had himself renamed sort of the CEO of the state, and so on and so forth. Now, this guy was not a stupid politician. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he had actually come to be the chief minister, defeating the odds of a very strong existing political system which he went against. So there was a very well thought out process to why technology was used in building his image. And I saw that this was a very consistent pattern, not only in Chandrababu Naidu, but in various other chief ministers in the south of India. Kerala being an unusual exception to that, and I can get into that in greater detail in question and answers. But what I find is that it was interesting not only as a contrast from what India's development had been in the post-1950s area, in which technocracy was something restricted more to the bureaucracy than to the electoral politics, versus the 1990s, where it comes more and more into how politicians, especially the ones with urban vote banks, project themselves. Now, what's also interesting is that a lot of these and over here I have is Jayalalitha and Dayanadi Maran, both of who are from Tamil Nadu, and Chandrababu Naidu from Andhra Pradesh. And the third state, Karnataka, is also equally important for the same reasons. But all of these chief ministers were largely trying to attract international investment. And this was an important part of what they were doing. Second thing, I'm going to shift gears very quickly. How much time do I have? Well, I have another 5 minutes. Cinema and computers. Does anybody actually recognize this picture from the top? There's some really old people here, if you do recognize it. Yes! So, another part of my work has gone into how cinema has looked at computers down the years starting in Western cinema, in Hollywood, and then eventually I look at how it is seen in Indian cinema and what that might be able to teach us. So there are some commonalities, right? So then there's the standard characters of the mad scientists and the hackers, as well as the themes of technological doomsday and omnipotent computers. HAL was an omnipotent computer. But what is the ICTD connection? The connection is, so I just couldn't really find very good pictures, so these are two pictures here. The connection is that all the themes which I outlined earlier exist in Indian cinema, but there's one theme which is completely absent in Western cinema, which is in Indian cinema. And that's the theme of the software worker. If you see somebody who's using a computer in most Hollywood films, it's likely to be like this cool young hacker kid, or something like that, or arch criminal or whatever it is. But in India, there's a whole slew of films in which the computer user is an aspirational young person who's building a career and a life around technology. And what's even more interesting is not only is this male characters, but even female characters. And if you know anything about Indian films, the female characters don't really have jobs. And if they have jobs, then that's probably because of the failure of the male character, dead or useless or something like that. And therefore, the woman has to get some construction job. And in any of these situations, the woman is at high risk from the male protagonist or antagonist, as it may be, in her functioning as a part of the economy. The software movies completely change this, where there's a number of films which you see in the late 90s, especially in the early 2000s, and especially in the south of India, where there are women who are getting out of college and doing jobs in software. And they might eventually, at the end of the movie, get married and have children, but at least there was an interregnum of some point in which their jobs are actually referred to. What I find interesting is that there is a distinction between what I call mass cinema and urban cinema. So, broadly, in India, when the films are made, there is a market which is known as a mass market, which usually is a B and C circuit. This is actually the official term, I'm not trying to be derogatory, which go to the villages. And these films tend to be much more populist, and there's this rural thug kind of person who beats everybody, and so on and so forth. And the themes around technology in these mass cinema are much more antiquated and around the ideas of technology as omnipotent, but they lack the aspirational software characters, which are much more in the urban cinema. So there's almost this competing ideas, a discourse of what it means to be a modernizing person, family or woman, versus what it is to be like a big thuggish character, but who can master computers and fight villains through that as well. So, what's also very interesting is everybody's heard the term Bollywood by now, but there is a term called Kollywood, which refers to the South Indian cinema, and there's Tollywood, which refers to East Indian cinema, and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of our work, Hindi film has almost no prevalence of the software engineer character. South Indian film is full of it, which is extremely interesting to me because it's mostly in South India where the whole technology boom has been more centered. And that's become much more part of the popular media discourse in South India for that reason. So all of these themes are stuff that I'm currently working around. It's almost like I took a quantum leap from doing useful things for the world to... Now, why is this related to classrooms? Yeah. So I already went through the whole process of how I started wondering what cinema does to encourage people to either use computers or get their children to use computers. And two really important arguments came out. One is I would have people tell me that a computer is needed for everything nowadays. It's a very standard response I get from parents. And another set of responses, which was a computer can do anything. I think that there's a very important distinction between the two, vis-a-vis where you see one person who has an idea of what it can do for them versus a more mythical idea of what a computer is. And the reason why I think it's important for us to understand this as serious ICT scholars is because we often enter a place where it looks like everybody wants the technology intervention, and once it flies, nobody starts to use it. What is it that does this. And I think to get at that question, we need to start understanding this discourse of technology that exists once we enter the place. Another important thing, I think, frankly, my bigger theory of why ICTD has become big in India is because it's like a clear transplant, in my mind, of middle class aspiration pulled downwards to a more rural and a lower class. Like it's like there are people from the middle classes who dictate that we should be putting technology in villages, and very often not very well thought out. And over a period of time, we at TIER have seen a number of projects which are like this. And I think that in understanding that, it's to see where the middle class aspiration ties in with how the projects are being implemented on the field. And finally, like I said, to understand why people are, well, I'm just repeating what I just said because I didn't see what my slide said properly, but you get my point, that to understand what people are doing, we should look at movies. So that's it for me. 5 years of TIER, thanks a lot. Actually, Eric, a hand to you. It was great time working with TIER. Like I said, research. And also a special thanks to everybody from Intel who's here because they have a nice bar of food for TIER. Yeah, there you go. So that's it. I have a couple of minutes for questions before we move on to the next panel. And I have a lot of stuff written on movies if you want. I can tell you some. John?
Movies too. So I thought that was a very interesting sort of direction to suggest. So then I think it suggests the standard question, which is if aspirations are an important element in sort of strategically looking at people's long-term behaviors, is do you think it's primarily an analysis problem? That is, do you treat these aspirations as a sort of cultural invariants that are somehow already in place, or are they things that could be sort of steered and manipulated the way that other sort of development projects try to steer them? And if the latter, are you planning to be an actor in some of those films?
That's a good question. Actually, let me answer the latter first because it actually has something important. I wrote a movie script and I took it to many movie producers, and then some of them would tell me something like, this script doesn't have enough sentiment. So the first time it made me think, is it really a back and forth process where it's a chicken and egg? You don't really understand why films say something because it's a reflection of society. Or are movie producers actively telling jokers like me, no, you need to have a scene with a computer and a child in it? So that's a good question, and I don't know if I answered it at all. But I will say that the whole side about engineering the aspiration in a certain way is not, I don't think it's entirely possible. I think that what we've seen is that there is an excitement about something that could get going because of the cinema, and it might have interesting after effects, at least second generation effects. To give you an example, the children who are going to use computers might end up doing something in the future or staying in school longer because they were excited about their favorite actor who does this stuff with computers. But overall, it's dangerous to put this idea out there that this technology is going to get people somewhere. We see this definitely a lot with young professionals who put in a lot of family money towards getting computer courses and then can't get jobs, either because they have very thick accents or some other kind of problem which they don't have the right networks in cities. So it's a complex problem.
Hi, Joyojeet.
Yes.
I just wanted to chime in and say how, absolutely brilliant I think this line of thinking is to pursue, and how very unorthodox. I wondered if you had, I actually reread Everett Rogers' Diffusion of Innovations recently, and he actually draws a distinction between two forms of communication, interpersonal and mass media communication, that inform the way that people make decisions about adopting technology. And I would call that a very orthodox notion of how innovations diffuse and why people adopt. And it seems to suggest that people adopt technologies by thinking very rationally and sensibly about whether they will benefit in some specific way from that technology. And I think what you're showing, and similarly to some of the things I'm finding in the way people adopt the internet in Ghana, it's not that, rational. It's not that driven by practical reasoning, practical thoughts about, specific ways in which people will benefit. Similarly to Roger's thinking, there's this whole idea of the technology acceptance model, which similarly, pursues that line of reasoning. I wondered if you had done any effort to kind of relate it to those more traditional models of how innovations diffuse.
Yeah, so to tell you the truth, I really haven't, and this work came as a byproduct of something entirely different that I was doing. But to answer a part of your question, what's definitely happened for me in the 5 years of TIER is that I've steered farther and farther away from how adults take on technology to how children take on technology. Because I've found that in this ICTD space, the most exciting part is among children's adoption because there is no goal involved in that adoption. It just comes organically. Whereas in the adults, we're either trying to build things around their existing livelihoods, whether it's agriculture or fisheries or something, where there's a push around the technology, and it doesn't work that way for adults. Children, they pick it up and they fly.
So I had one question, which is, or actually sort of one suggestion, which is that there's some really interesting collaboration going on between the public health community and companies. And so the public health community, when they're trying to promote a particular behavioral change, like can we get people to wash their hands before eating, have increasingly recognized that their old way of trying to do this, namely, preaching about the public health benefits associated with this, has limited efficacy, and that if they can learn how companies have learned to establish habits, that they can develop interventions around behavior change that are more effective. Now, that presupposes that there's some behavior change that you feel you ought to be promoting, but it seems like another interesting area to explore.
So here is a specific challenge based on your very first slide.
You want me to go back?
Not a big deal. But in Tamil Nadu, for example, everybody loves Talaivar Rajinikanth.
Yes.
And if Rajinikanth says something or Rajinikanth says something else, there would be a huge hysteria about people actually following that.
Yes.
Now, and every village sort of has a TV or a video projection system where they have the concept of showing movies on a weekly basis. So if you use movies as a way of reaching out to people, I can sort of bet that at least 80% of people in Tamil Nadu have seen the movie Shivaji. So if you had a way of mobilizing a popular character like Rajinikanth and a way of promoting technology or some notion of ICTD from the perspective of a movie or an advertisement, can that be used as a catalyst to bring in mass behavioral change?
Sure. So I'm not sure that I agree that film stars have that kind of potential. I do agree that there's a hysteria around them, but there's been many cases in the past where there's been film stars who've been trying to push family planning. They've used this in India specifically, and it hasn't worked as well. What I'm trying to say here is that it's not just one specific personality, but a larger reflection of many things going on at the same time. And it may or may not necessarily be true that you can steer people's behavior with this if you made an attempt to do it. Okay, so it is like it's happening because there is a sense that there's already this discourse about computers being omnipotent among people. And it's just reflected differently in different types of movies. But I would think it's kind of far-fetched to say that if I got Rajinikanth, like one example is Rajinikanth stopped smoking and he started chewing gum in movies. Rajinikanth is a big star, he's the guy over there. He's actually like 70 years old or something. But he started chewing gum in movies, but has that affected cigarette smoking? No, it hasn't. In fact, cigarette smoking has gone up in India in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's a long call.
So I'm just wondering, there must have been a lot more of this study in the early days of India or in the history of other communist countries where the
I referred
film
to
and
that.
media were, yeah. Because in fact, the rhetorics in those films generally are a lot about aspirations
Yes.
and essentially, you know, inculcating a development desire within the population. So,
There was
Soviet
a
German
Soviet
films,
film, actually,
okay.
which
Yeah,
started this off.
Soviet, and I would say now, perhaps still in China and other communist countries.
Yeah.
So at least one could look at the successes and failures. I mean, they would have a mature understanding of what works, perhaps. Especially, I mean, China is an interesting kind of mix of increasingly open, but basically a centrally managed country. India is in that sense, it's much more modern, perhaps, in its media than other
Which
developing
is
countries.
exactly what makes the Indian case more interesting to me.
Yeah.
Is that there is some amount of the producer telling you what to do, but it's coming out organically from.
Okay.